All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, so a note to our internet audience watching at home. If at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, you can just call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We'll have the author sign it, and we'll ship it to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. Well, this evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome back Mr. Steve Almond, presenting his new book, Against Football, One Fan's Reluctant Manifesto. Mr. Almond's going to be in a discussion format tonight with our special guest, Mr. Chuck Strauss from the New Times. I'm going to hand it right over to these guys, so please give a welcome to our panelists, Mr. Steve Almond and Mr. Chuck Strauss.
All right, so I'm gonna read just a little bit from the book, and then Chuck's gonna ask me a couple of questions, and then if you guys have questions, then you'll ask me those some questions, and then if you don't, then the internet will just hear silence, which I think actually was probably an improvement on the internet. I'd also ask that if there are people who, for reasons probably having to do with my reputation for spitting, are at the back of the room rather than the first couple of rows, you can move up. That would be terrific if you would. It's very disquieting to have people literally lined up against the bookshelf back there and not sitting here in front. So go ahead and move up. Perfect. Yes. Fantastic. Hello, hello, hello. You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to read one section of the book, and then I'll have Chuck ask some questions. So this is from a chapter called The Love Song of Richie Incognito, which I hope has a little special relevance for those of you who are Miami Dolphins fans. How many people are Miami Dolphins fans, I guess? And go ahead and really, how are the Dolphins this year? Are they doing anything? They're 5-4, so that's better than 500. So you know who Richie Incognito is, and I won't spend time detailing him. The chapter does that, but I begin the chapter by just describing the experience of watching a football game with somebody who is not familiar with football. We're all kind of swimming in it. It's our most popular and profitable sport, so we all know it and think of it as a relatively normal game. But here's what football actually looks like if you are not a native football watcher. I once made the mistake of watching a football game with an Italian woman who was studying medieval gender roles and with whom, rather unimaginatively, I hoped to have sex. It was the sort of mistake one makes in one's 20s before one has developed a proper appreciation for the virtues of compartmentalization. They're spending most times hugging, Elena observed. Those are blocks, I said. Then at the end, they make a big pile on the ground and grind each other. There's no grinding, I said. Then they spank the others on the behind. It's a gay ritual. I don't think so, I said. But look, before each time, the skinny one, the sex leader, the quarterback. He makes all the big boys bend over. Then he chooses his favorite and comes up behind the lucky one and makes a pantomime of sodomy. No, I said. No, no, no. That's the snap. It's how the play starts. And the quarterback gets the ball from one guy, the center. It's not a choice. He can't just come up to, like, the tight end. Elena looked at me for several complicated European seconds. The what? So that is what football looks like to those of you who are not, to people who are not native football fans. And I'll read maybe one more little quick section of the book that's just right at the end that I think kind of gets at what the... It does, in fact. My take on Richie Incognito, well, the way that the Richie Incognito story was played was that it was an incident of kind of macho bullying. And the way that I actually read the transcript of the Richie Incognito episode is that it was actually about a forbidden homosexual impulse. That I won't say homosexual, homoerotic impulse. I think that Richie Incognito and Jonathan Martin were in love with one another, at least that Richie Incognito had very complicated... Chuck, I know you think that's funny, but I prove it in the book. And now, in an effort to address you feeling that that's funny, I think I have to read some of that to try to explain what I mean by this. I absolutely will. That's just about to happen, ma'am.
Moving forward.
Okay. Here we go. This is going to be really interesting. Incognito also makes, this is the Wells report, which was the report that they compiled about Richie Incognito. We're going to go right to it because of you. Incognito also makes vulgar comments about Martin's mother, and in particular his sister, a medical student whom he has never met. Quote, "I'm going to bang the shit out of her and spit on her and treat her like shit," is one of his milder offerings. Like a lot of dudes who traffic in this sort of casual misogyny, Incognito and his pals also spout a lot of homophobic trash talk. In addition to hurling racist slurs at a Japanese assistant trainer, Incognito makes it a point to ask him for, quote, "rubby, rubby, sucky, sucky." He nicknames another submissive teammate Loose Booty and routinely grabs him and asks him for a hug. The homophobia has an anxious compensatory feel to it. At one point, Pouncy, you cannot make these names up. Pouncy, his fellow bully. At one point, Pouncy restrains Loose Booty and tells John Jerry, another teammate, to, quote, "come get some pussy." Jerry then touches the victim's ass in a way that simulates anal penetration because, you know, that's how you prove you're definitely not gay. What's most striking about the Wells report is its depiction of the volatile friendship between Incognito and Martin. Teammates describe the two as inseparable. In the course of their stormy 14-month relationship, they exchanged 13,000 text messages, or nearly 30 a day. They seek each other out, quote, "at all hours of the day and night," and discuss, quote, "the intimate details of their sex lives, often in graphic terms." But the deeper one reads into the report, the more it seems to describe a psychic crisis. Richie Incognito is guilty of bullying, but his true crime seems to be the harbor's forbidden desires for Jonathan Martin. As he admits to investigators, his term of preference for Martin is, quote, "my bitch." When Martin declines his offers to socialize or to take trips together, Incognito reacts like a spurned lover. His invective reflects a familiar preoccupation. At one point, Incognito pressures Martin to vacation with him in Las Vegas. Here's the exchange of text messages that causes Martin to back out. Are you guys happy that you're hearing this? Oh, well. Incognito. These are all his text messages. They're kind of awesome. "No dude hookers," meaning male prostitutes, "you faggot." That's what he writes to Martin. Incognito, "don't blame your gay tendencies on Loose Booty," because Incognito never projects. Okay, Martin, "I'm going to get more bitches in 2 nights than all of you combined." Incognito, "stop it. By bitches, you mean cocks in your mouth." Incognito, "you fucking mulatto liberal bitch." Incognito, "I'm going to shit in your eye." Incognito, "good night, slut." Which I think he wrote a children's book called Good Night, Slut that was very unsuccessful, interestingly. But beneath his profane banter, a genuine tenderness emerges. "Let's get weird tonight," Incognito writes to Martin at one point, and a bit later, "What's up, pussy? I love you." Even after Martin has left the team amid controversy, the two continue to text. "I miss us," Incognito writes. And I go on for a little bit, but the point I make is not necessarily that Richie Incognito is gay and wanted to have gay sex with Jonathan Martin. The point I make is that, much like you could say Achilles and Patroclus, football players live in a world, it's a motherless world, it's a world in which they seek out the company of other men. They eat with other men, they bathe with other men, they are constantly in contact with other men. It's not that they necessarily want to have sex with one another, but they are the most intimate. You know, that's what, whether or not Achilles was having sex with Patroclus, the person he loved on earth the most was Patroclus. And I try to make that point about Richie Incognito and Jonathan Martin. If you dig beneath all this weird compensatory homophobia, there's an awful, it's in place to try to keep at bay other feelings that are far more forbidden, which have to do with really seeking the right to be intimate with another man in a world in which any hint of any homosexual impulse is absolutely forbidden, would be like the highest crime.
So against football, then, is against homophobia?
No, I would say that against football is actually for a realistic accounting of what it means that this exalted cult of masculinity is such a huge deal in our culture, and what it means for the players. You know, there's a sort of superficial narrative that sort of says, well, gosh, football is just the most macho thing you can do. But the thing that's striking about Richie Incognito and Jonathan Martin is, I'm sorry, 30 texts a day at all hours of the day and night, that describes a very intimate relationship. That is, they discuss the most intimate aspects of their, that's a kind of brotherhood that in a certain way is closer than most people are with their spouse. And football players continue to feel this way. The brotherhood of people, are there anybody here who plays football or played football? They feel as closer to one another than they do with anybody else. With somebody like Incognito, I guess what I'm arguing for is a more honest accounting of what that report was about. I thought of it as very much like the Starr reports. What was interesting about the Starr report was not that Clinton was, having sex with an intern. It was that Kenneth Starr was like perversely obsessed with it. The revelation of that report is that the narrator is this kind of crazy, horny Puritan. And the Wells report is like, there's a counter narrative there, which is that these two, I'm glad Lynn Barrett is entertained. That's like my whole night is made, okay? I think it happens with all sort of male enclaves, or sort of sports are about, sports to me, especially the macho male sports, are about how men, both the players and the fans, purchase the right to be intimate with one another. But in order to do that, they have to vouchsafe their heterosexuality. That's what we do, right, dudes, when we watch a ball game. That's part of what we're doing, is being like, right, you're not a faggot, right? Right. No, I'm not, because I like football. Good. Now we can actually talk about it. Now we can talk about our lives. I think that's a lot of what sports is about in this culture. It's a way for men to communicate without feeling at risk of sort of tipping over into an unacceptable affection and desire to commune with other men.
No, but I think the question, and I think it's really a good one, is why did you choose football to come out against rather than soccer, right, or some other less profitable sport?
Well, partly because, the central reason is because I've been a huge football fan. And so I feel the anguish of the apostate, of somebody who bought into football and its values sort of mindlessly for 40 years and supported it. Anybody who's a fan at a certain point, you're the sponsors of the game. The NFL doesn't exist, nor does the NCAA, nor does high school football, frankly, unless fans are deeply invested in it. We built the football industrial complex. So I had that guilt to contend with and that personal connection. The book is also kind of a love letter to football and its strategic density and how dramatically satisfying it is and my personal stake in it. So that's why I didn't write about other sports, and that's why I wrote about. But I also think football is the biggest thing in America. It's not the biggest sport in America. It is the biggest common narrative in America. It's the biggest thing we all have in common, and it's one of the most profitable industries. And the fact that it's a sport means that it's essentially been completely morally unregulated in the media and in the world of egghead cultural critics and academics. Football has been profoundly affecting the economics of communities like Miami and every other place that it's infiltrated our educational system to the point that when I say the University of Miami, you don't even think of an educational institution. You think of a football team. That's not true, but you're in a bookstore. Trust me. Most people think of a football team. And that's part of what your job is, I think, as a writer or somebody who's thinking about a cultural critic, is to say, well, gee, what are Americans really passionate about, and what does it mean? What does it mean that we have decided that the narrative, the biggest narrative that we all have in common is a child's game that's been turned into a huge corporatized form of simulated combat and played mostly by huge muscled African-American men. What does that mean? What does that mean specifically in a city or county like Dade County? It has deep meaning on about 10 different levels, and that's what the book is trying to parse.
I'm going to ask one question, and then I think everybody ought to ask their own, because I think everybody has an idea about football. But, you did a thing for us the other day for New Times, where Steve used to work, by the way, called the top 10 reasons to say screw the NFL. And the number one reason was false dreams. Right. So you want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure. I'm only pushing this mic at you. It's not a fallow-aggressive attack. They told me that you're supposed to. Or maybe it is. So, as a football fan, for 40 years, I carried around, as every football player or every football fan does, like a suitcase of rationalizations that were kind of the lines that I told myself in order to justify watching the game. And like the first and biggest one would be, well, these guys, and Obama uses this one, these guys are adults and they get paid a lot of money, and so it's okay. They're adults. They knowingly incur this risk. And the point of the book is to interrogate our decision as fans to watch. Because without us, actually, they don't get paid those huge salaries, and they don't get that kind of cultural acclaim. Another, to me, the most insidious thing that people say, and I hear it all the time as I talk about this book, is, yeah, but for certain kids, football is the only opportunity that they would have to go to college or to make a lot of money. And I actually think that's the most perverse and degrading myth of all, for a couple of reasons. One, when we say certain kids, in the coded language that we use in this country, we're really talking about poor kids, kids from economically vulnerable communities, and oftentimes kids of color. And what we're essentially saying is, you, kid of color, your worth in this world resides not in the development of your moral system, not in the development of your intellectual or academic capacities, and not in the content of your character. No. For you, your chance, your ticket, your golden path resides in getting really good at a beautiful but savage game that has a decent chance, if you get really good at it, at appreciably shortening your life and damaging your brain. For our entertainment, as we sit with our chicken wings in decadent America and consume that savagery. And also, in addition to how degrading that is, there's also the fact that 1 in 500 high school seniors who plays football is going to go on to the NFL. They'll spend about 3.5 years in the NFL, and they'll be in economic trouble, chances are, within a few years after that. They're probably going to be about 30 years old when they find themselves with no real other second plan. Because in order to get good at football, you have to spend a huge number of hours every day in order to play at the highest level. That's just the way it works. It is such a complex game. It's so exacting, intellectually, physically. You just are literally segregated from the rest of the population, and you, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but in order to get really good at football at the college level, you have to spend a tremendous amount of your whole selfhood, identity, body, and mind single-mindedly devoted to that game to get really good at it. The other 499 kids from economically vulnerable neighborhoods, probably kids of color, we don't give a shit about, frankly. And we throw out the myth, yeah, but certain kids, and the truth is, actually, we don't even care about the kids who become great football players, except that they're great football players. That's what we care about. We want them to entertain us. The school administrators who recruit them, the football coaches who recruit them would love it if they get an education, but what they really want, and the reason they're on campus is what? To bang heads on Saturday. That's why they're there. Does anybody go, well, I wonder how that tailback did on his anthropology exam? Come on, let's not live a lie, at least be honest about it. We want them to entertain us. And at the pro level, we love it when they're entertaining us. And as soon as they leave the field, as soon as they are out of our television screen view, we do not care about them. It's a cynical arrangement, and I was a part of that arrangement. But that's why I think it's not only a false dream, but it's profoundly corrosive to the national soul. What the 499 other kids in Liberty City or Overtown or Opelika or wherever it is need are what? Good schools, support for working families. Come on. The stuff that any mature democracy, like all the ones over in Scandinavia, have figured out. Okay.
Anybody got a comment or a question for Steve about it? Or
You've been a fan for 40 years, a huge fan. Why now? Why do you see the light now?
Wow. Yes. Great question. So the question is, why now, dude, after 40 years? And the answer is actually that my evolution on this has been gradual. One of the things that got me thinking critically about the game was reviewing The Blind Side, that amazing book by Michael Lewis, which is a thrilling book and beautifully written, and I think he's The Big Short is an amazing, but he's a wonderful journalist. But right in the center of that book, The Blind Side, and I name the chapter about race The Blind Spot, and I talk about this in the book. Right at the center of that book is this odd question. The book is about an African-American teenage kid who's, I don't know, 6'7" and 320 pounds, who essentially sort of gets adopted by a rich white family in Tennessee. They manage to game the educational system so that he gets into a private school, and then he goes off to this couple's alma mater and ends up in the pros. And it's supposed to be this heroic kind of Horatio Alger story of, hey, he made his dream. But right in the middle of the book, the kid asks this question. He says to his adoptive white mother, but if I couldn't play football and I was just going to be flipping burgers for the rest of my life, would you have still adopted me? Would you have still taken me into your home? Does anybody in this room think that the answer to that is yes? Just out of the kindness of their heart, they decided to rescue this one kid? And nobody in the book answers that question. Nobody in the book answers that question because in addition to being an inspiring Horatio Alger story, that book, in an unacknowledged way, is a story of racial exploitation and a kind of objectification. And I realized that reading the book. I was like, wait a second, there's kind of a counter-narrative, like with the Wells Report. So that was one thing. And I remember reviewing the TV show Friday Night Lights, and that is even more crazy and pathological. That essentially presents the idea that high school is sort of a substrate for a high school football team, which is just pathological if you really think about it, especially given that we now know that subconcussive hits cause high school students to have diminished brain function, if the ones who play football. The big thing that I think caused me to decide to write the book had to do with my mom suffering an acute dementia. Because part of the way that the NFL operates and football in general is they present a spectacle that's so thrilling, so absorbing, and so beautiful and so dramatically satisfying that the fan never thinks about what it means that Junior Seau got dementia and put a bullet in his chest, or Dave Durson or anybody else. What's that? Dave Durson, yeah, a whole bunch of players. We just we agree not to think about it because what we see is so heroic. In the same way that war movies or the coverage of war presents young men who are in these heroic situations, and we kind of consent to that, and we don't really want to deal with or even look at how they're psychically or physically disfigured later. We just don't want to think about it. But when you walk into a hospital room and your mother suddenly is gone, her brain is gone, and she is gone, and she doesn't know why she's there, and she's disoriented, and it suddenly becomes real. And that those synapses that are disconnected by design suddenly link up. And that was, I think, the thing, seeing my mom in this state of essentially advanced dementia, that caused me to say, holy shit, I watch a game in which that is a routine byproduct. I might not see it, I might choose to not see it, but that's actually what ends up happening to, what did the NFL just admit? 28% of their players, nearly a third of their players are going to wind up with long-term cognitive ailments, in other words, brain damage. So, but for me, it was, I think that was the thing. And then once you start investigating the NFL and college football, I didn't know a lot of this stuff. I had no idea that the NFL was tax exempt. I had no idea that they were a legal monopoly. I had no idea that 70% of the funding for their stadiums comes from you, the taxpayers. I just didn't know a lot of the stuff about the NFL. I'd never read the Wells Report. The more you look at it, the more insane it becomes, or the more, to me, more and more disturbing. So if I sound kind of crazy and froth at the mouth, it's because I sort of looked, I kind of looked behind the curtain, and it freaked me out. Yep.
Maybe it seems some kind of brown-nosing or sycophantic, but I noticed among my contemporaries sort of a reverence for certain football teams that mimics very much their parents' allegiance towards certain teams and their grandparents' allegiance towards certain teams. Do you feel that in the light of certain, of sort of the racial component that you're alluding to now, do you feel that millennials' allegiance to certain teams has to be different from what their parents felt or their grandparents felt?
Well, here's what's happening big picture with football. Two things are happening. One, physics and physiology and medical research has caught up to the game. The big thing that, and I am getting around to answering your question, I'm just taking it a long way, as is my want. For years, people just didn't know or think very much about, well, what is the effect of football on players later in their life? And also, football players were much smaller, and they weren't as fast. High school players right now in big programs in Texas are 300 pounds. The linemen are 300 pounds. That's bigger than any football player was 30 years ago. So when they talk about football having a concussion problem, that's bullshit. Here's what football has. It has a violence problem, and underneath that, it has a physics and physiology problem. Mass times acceleration is always going to equal force, and that's the physics part. And the players are bigger and stronger and faster, therefore they are actually more dangerous as projectiles. And the brain is always going to be a soft organ that is encased inside a hard shell, unless we evolve very quickly and alarmingly. That is always going to be the case. And the danger now that researchers have caught up, the medical research has caught up, is that we realize it isn't big catastrophic concussive hits that pose the central danger. It's the accretion of the hundreds and thousands of subconcussive hits that wind up causing players to show diminished brain function or develop long-term brain damage. There was a study in Purdue, a high school of high school football players. They put monitors inside their helmets, and what was alarming about it was as they tracked them over the course of the season, they wanted to see how do concussions affect these kids' brain function. So they put monitors in 24 students, high school football players, and some of them had gotten concussions, and then they had a control group of kids who'd never suffered a concussion, so they should be fine, right? The problem is the control group showed diminished brain function to the point that by the end of the year, some of the kids had no brain function in their frontal lobes. As a reminder, high school students, okay? Think about if that was a gas leak in the cafeteria and it was causing diminished brain function in a high school student. How quickly do you think that school would be shut down and sued, and the national media would descend along with lawyers and so forth? So we now know that there are these dangers, and millennials and everybody who watches football has to kind of deal with it a little bit more. There was just a story this past weekend in the Times Magazine about the legal case in which 5,000 former NFL players are suing the NFL, not just to pay for their medical expenses, but for deceptive practices and fraud, essentially like the tobacco industry. They tried to hide the dangers of their workplace. That's now publicly known, and every time a football player suffers from dementia or Brett Favre goes on TV and admits that he can't remember how to get home from his kid's practice or whatever, it's a big story. So in a way, the millennials are going to have to, I think, and everybody else are going to have to contend with a view of football that's much more morally marbled. It's much more complicated. But football is always going to be, in other sports for that matter, one of the central ways in which kids try to connect, especially with dads. As I've talked with people about why they're fans, especially female fans, because football does, after all, represent these crazy, toxic gender roles that are wildly out of sync with most of our values. Men are big, strong dudes who are only effective through their use of force, right? And women are sexual ornaments, essentially, jiggling on the sidelines. That's what my daughter would see if I put her in front of a football game. That's not how most of us think about us. But when I always ask women when they're big football fans, well, why? Why do you watch a sport in which your role is to be on the sidelines bouncing your boobies? Okay, and you're just automatically excluded from that game, and that defines masculinity as so violent and aggressive. And the answer is almost inevitably, well, my dad watched, and that's how you got access to dad. And how many people can say that? Like what? And I don't want it to sound insulting, but almost always, if you come to the game, it's because you're sort of trying to get. For men, you're trying to or boys, you're trying to understand and be a part of the world of men as you understand it. And I think that's becoming more complicated as football becomes morally a little bit more, like we're finally recognizing that it's a blood sport, even though it's covered up in pretty uniforms and you never see their heads bleeding and so forth. So, yes, Lynn Barrett.
I did as a student, so I remember my name. So I really encountered this when my son was in kindergarten, and as he entered kindergarten, and we're from a family of people who do track so we're just cowards who run fast. Just in case
Good. Like most of human beings, right?
Never hitting other people, but there were any number of children who were repeating kindergarten, junior kindergarten, because, and I was like, what's up? You know, kindergarten, how stupid do you have to be be repeating that? And it turned out their fathers wanted them to be the oldest kid in their class when they got to be further along, because the fathers had felt wimpy or humiliated. And and here's the word that came up over and over and over, they wanted them to be dominant, which is that word shows up in all these different places. The pickup artist insanity and all these places wanted them to be dominant because they've been humiliated. So there's this male narrative of humiliation and dominance, which and the issue is like, so these kids are really little and they're really little, and they're being told like, the thing I want you to do is to be like, in a weird way humiliated because you're in the 3rd grade and you're shaving because I've made you so you'll be the biggest, strongest one. So can you talk a little bit about the humiliation side of the dominance?
Yeah, I certainly will, as somebody who's rarely dominant and often humiliated. You had a sense. So one of the chapters is called Their Sons Grow Suicidally Beautiful, and so I'll read a little bit. One of the things I do is so I'll just read a little bit and read a little bit of this poem. So why do Americans not only accept high school football, but in certain regions worship it? What is it in our national psychology that gets off on seeing boys engage in such a savage game? I think there's some kind of shame mixed up in it, the shame of men whose dreams have collapsed. And I mean by this the fathers. Here's what James Wright, the poet James Wright, had to say on the subject in his poem, Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio, which I've been unable to get out of my head. And this is a little bit of that poem. All the proud fathers are ashamed to go home. Their women cluck like starved pullets dying for love. Therefore, their sons grow suicidally beautiful at the beginning of October and gallop terribly against each other's bodies. Now, having said that, I don't think that all dads want their sons to play football as some kind of compensatory macho power trip or, kind of crazy compensatory effort. I think sometimes kids find themselves, find direction, find discipline, find some sense of allegiance and a kind of a fellowship or a brotherhood. And that's beautiful and wonderful. What I think is inextricably tragic is that it has to be in a game that's so profoundly violent and dangerous to their health. And I actually think that there's this other line that goes around. The only way, and this is part of patriarchal culture that we just have been unable to evolve past. The only way to really become a man is you got to get knocked down and then you got to get up again. It's this kind of George Patton macho psychosis. There are lots of ways for kids to learn perseverance. They can learn that and character in the old sense of that word. They can learn that from a great teacher or an inspiring pastor or from a supportive parent who in the face of some kind of failure exhorts them and supports them to keep getting up in whatever way, or even a great book, God forbid. So it's a peculiarly American notion that I think has to do with the fact that this idea of regeneration through violence is part of our bloodstream. That the national spirit has always been recharged through violence, whether it's the revolution or the frontier or whatever it's been, these wars that we're continually getting into. But I think in some cases there is this kind of pathological concern with status and masculinity that ultimately arises from feeling humiliated by the world and emasculated by it. And it is transmitted through a desire to have the son be dominant in the one way that is sanctioned, that is essentially sadistic. I had a high school football player who was in the audience when I was giving a reading recently, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, you know what the coach used to tell us? He used to say, now boys, I want you to listen. What you can do on this field would get you arrested anywhere else. And he meant that as like an exhortation, like let it all hang out. This is the one place where you can let your crazy masculine anarchic id out of the box. And I think that's very exciting because everybody has that, but I think men have that in spades, and I think it can be turned in directions that are really corrosive and that have more to do with being deep down weak and afraid, and rather than really seeking a form of discipline, perseverance, all that good stuff that's in football. So, yep.
Get compensated for its endorsement of, now it's the cure for breast cancer. Before it was United Way, but they really spend a lot of time promoting these charities. I'm wondering if they're compensated in some manner.
Well, they're compensated by growing their market share and by growing their brand. I don't know the exact figure, but I think it's something you would have to look it up, and it's probably not hard to find. But somebody told me recently, and so I want to be careful to frame this as extreme secondhand, wouldn't pass journalistic muster, but a fairly small percentage of the proceeds from NFL activities actually goes to those charities. It sounds like a big number because the NFL is a $10 billion a year industry, and college football is billions as well. But the central reason that they slap pink cleats on their players and that they make a big to-do about the United Way and so forth is because the NFL as an entity, their central function civically is to suck money from the public till and essentially siphon it into the pockets of billionaire owners. That's the economic setup. In New Orleans, it was $1 billion of taxpayer revenue that was used to build that stadium. And that's fine if the citizens of New Orleans wanted to invest $1 billion in that stadium and they saw a significant return on that investment, absolutely. But the way that the NFL as a legal monopoly can operate is, if they don't like being in one city, if an owner wants to increase the value of his franchise, he'll just leave and go to a new city that will give him better terms. They hold all the marbles because of our devotion as fans. So, for instance, Art Modell pretty famously moved the Browns out of Cleveland. Why did he do that? Because the citizens of Baltimore, the politicians of Baltimore anyway, provided him a free stadium, 30 years rent-free, $200 million back in 1995, which is a lot more these days. And Art Modell got 100% of the proceeds from the parking, the luxury suites, the concessions, everything, the naming rights, all of it. He quintupled the value of that franchise by moving it to a new city. It's called franchise free agency. This is also the reason, for instance, that Jacksonville has a franchise and that Los Angeles doesn't. Did it ever occur to you how strange that is? That's because the city elders of Jacksonville were so desperate to have a team and whatever sense of community or identity or we're a big city now that fosters, that they give huge amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, taxpayer money, to build stadiums and facilities and infrastructure and so forth to support a team. And again, there's no return for the community. They get very little. And the idea that an NFL franchise is an economic engine for a city is complete fucking bullshit. What it does is create several thousand low-wage jobs 10 times a year. And the vast majority of those revenues, TV broadcast revenues, go directly into the pockets of the NFL and are distributed to their billionaire owners. That is not real economic development. It's bullshit. It's the circus. It's not a mall. Okay.
In the elevator,
yes,
and the Adrian Peterson child beating that went on, football has started a kind of a reform effort, right? Or they say they have. You don't buy it?
Chuck. Here's the deal. The NFL is a huge corporation. The way that corporations operate, despite the beautiful fantasy of Mitt Romney, is that they have a cash register in the place that in a actual human being there would be a conscience. That's how it works. That's their job, is to make money. And you need to, especially a discerning, critical journalist like yourself, every decision they make should be through the lens that it's a $9 billion, soon to be $10 and then $20 billion corporation, whether it's slapping pink cleats on their players in order to attract a demographic that they're sorely in need of, female fans and casual fans who can say, oh, well, it is kind of savage, and it does seem they're hitting each other awfully hard, and they do keep stopping play every few minutes to cart an unconscious player off the field, but they sure do care about breast cancer awareness, or they really do give to the United Way. Like, come on, people. This is kind of Koch brothers reasoning. It's like watching a Koch brother ad and say, they seem pretty, look at those beautiful farms that they run. That's the way the NFL operates. Roger Goodell is a great commissioner. You know why? Not because he's a really moral guy, but because he makes them a lot of money. The reason he made $44 million last year is because he made the NFL $10 billion. That's what his salary is based on. That's what the whole system. I hope.
You seem to focus a lot on the NFL, but football in this country is much larger than the NFL, and it's much bigger at the college level.
Yep.
There's a map I saw the other day on social media that the highest paid person in
Most states.
80% of the states is a college football head coach.
Right.
So, and the conveyor belt of the college game is 100 times, the NFL. So the problem is not really at the NFL and the level of competition, but rather a more broad cultural investment. People do get a return from it. They get an emotional
Yes,
return from it.
absolutely. So let me say a couple things. That's a good point. 1.1 million kids play high school football in this country. And each of those 1.1 million kids has a family and a community and a set of coaches and that really support what they do. It's a huge, big deal emotionally and psychologically to those communities. It matters a lot. It matters to the kids and it matters to the people around those kids. And I don't want to poo-poo that. It's a powerful thing, and it can be powerfully good and positive, but it's also dangerous as hell. And I think I focus on the NFL because it's sort of the loss leader. The reason there are all those kids who are willing to withstand the hardship is because our culture says this is where you're going to wind up. This is the glory. This is the acclaim. And how much time have you spent with high school or college football players? I'm not saying that all of them harbor the dream of going to the NFL, but a significant number of them really have a reasonable sense that if they can make it to the level where they're good enough maybe to become a pro, essentially the world is their oyster. And that might not be true, but it's a powerful...
Everybody else is just...
Yeah, but when you're a high school or college football player, you don't sit there and go, I only have a 1 in 500 chance. That's not how it operates. You think, I could do it if I work hard, if I may not be the fastest, but I can do it if I get coached up, if I'm really devoted. That's the aspiration, is to make it to the pros. And also because the NFL and its values to have its insane monetization of the game has trickled down. The reason players are bigger, and actually Michael Lewis writes about this in The Blind Side. He says essentially what the NFL desired, America's colleges processed, America's high schools produced in a raw form, America's colleges processed and refined in order to, for the pros. It's not that it drives the whole thing, but it is the most garish and obvious representative of how monetized the game has become. It's become bigger and faster and more profitable and more naked in its desire for profit. To convert our devotion to athletic heroism into cold, hard cash.
It's more egregious at the college level because those kids don't get paid.
Dude, you're not going to get an argument from me. I think it's despicable that in colleges, that a leading signifier in our colleges is football. But the reason I focus a lot on the NFL is because that's sort of the common narrative that most people have, that everybody knows the pro game and the economics of how they operate are a little bit more open than college football, where a lot of it is public funding. It's mixed up in Title IX money, and it's much harder to trace the economics of it than it is with football, where there's only 28 teams or 30 teams. But I agree with you entirely. It's it has become what I call the football industrial complex. Yep.
Excuse me for deviating from a very constructive conversation about football, but I'm wondering how you, as a journalist, ascended to this position where you have around you sort of this cloud of fuck it, wherein you're willing to talk about these very sensitive subjects of race and gender, as you've touched upon today, and like, was there a point in your career where you would not have dared to touch upon these things, and how have you come to the point where you're willing to discuss these things in an open forum?
My cloud of fuck it. It's also my new perfume. It's my new cologne. It's called Fuck It. When you're not afraid to alienate those close to you, just fuck it. There is a market. There is a market. Driving away people since 2014. Well, I mean, here's the thing. I think actually it's probably relevant that you asked that in Miami, because part of my legacy is having been a journalist, and that the job of the free press is to, afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. That at least used to be. Now it's just stimulate people all the time through exciting their grievance. But previously, there is an ideal that still exists, and I'm a child of Watergate. I remember actually that the free press used to be capable of rooting out actual corruption and even bringing down, and that sunk in. That idea that there is this journalistic ethic, that we're the people's representative in Washington. So part of that fuck it or self-righteous right that I give myself comes from really being an idealist and a believer in that idea that part of your job is to speak out if you see something not just morally out there, but inside of us. As Victor was pointing out, I have 40 years on my conscience of being an insane supporter of football. And part of the book is an effort to talk about it's not just like football's terrible, it's much more like football is amazing and beautiful and as powerful in my mind as like alcohol. Like, I'm besotted by the game. And what is it in me? What is it that's wounded or humiliated or doubtful or wrecked that needed the game so much? And also, how is it that a bunch of business people are taking advantage of me and other dudes and dudettes in order to make a big sack full of money? And how is it as a culture that we consent to such a corrupt arrangement? The football to me is like America on steroids. It is this hardcore ethos. You're either a winner or you're a loser. And if you're a winner, you are beautiful and you are exalted and you are in the spotlight and you are replayed over and over again on TV screens at night, late at night, where lonely people stare at you and think about what they could have been. And sometimes in their secret caverns of their hearts still are. And if you're off the field, you're forgotten. You are nothing. That's America. That's America. Those are American values. It's a zero-sum game. In its most corrosive form, that is what capitalism is. Winners, everything. You're beautiful. And then the moment you're not a winner anymore, you're nowhere. You're gone. You just have been vaporized from the public imagination. That's how our government functions. A bunch of insane psychopaths with no actual moral agenda just got elected to a majority in this country. I defy anybody here to say what those psychopaths actually want to do. They don't have any fucking agenda. You know what their agenda is? Break government and cause the populace to become more and more disconnected from our moral responsibilities as citizens. That's their agenda.
Can you defend Roger Goodell, please, sir?
What's your question? Do I have to?
I hate to interrupt because you're just coming out of your shell.
I just sprayed some more fuck it.
Yeah, that quotient's going up. But I wondered if NFL or football is the next tobacco. And I mean that in two senses. One is financial, in that the collateral costs of football are still not evaluated.
Right.
So they're getting away with that as a freebie. And secondly, from the point of view that it used to be 40% of Americans smoke, 18% today.
Right.
And what happens if dad says, I don't want my son to do football, which I did with my sons 20 years ago.
Right.
What if it turns off
Right.
the public? Could there be a financial collapse?
I don't think that, well, nobody knows is the honest answer. Nobody really knows. Nobody knows. When is Wes Welker going to be knocked unconscious and maybe paralyzed like Daryl Stingley was back in 1975 live on TV? When is Brett Favre going to come out and publicly admit that he is suffering from dementia, or Steve Young, or any of these other guys? You know, those are things that could significantly move the public perception of football from the pro level all the way down. These two players, the quarterback at the University of Texas and University of UConn, you know, professional, really good quarterbacks, quit the game because they were cognizant of the fact that concussions could potentially really diminish their life, not just in length, but in quality. So that it is changing. But the reason that I would say that I'm not sure that tobacco is exactly the right analogy is it's not much fun to watch people smoke, but it's a lot of fun to watch people play football. And as long as fans are insulated from the risk, I think it's going to be hard for those two synapses to connect. It's true that boxing was once one of the most popular, if not the most popular American sport, and it, because of a moral awakening and mismanagement, but also because of moral awakening within the population, it didn't disappear. In fact, it's become even more vicious, you know, in these new iterations, but it became more of a fringe sport. It's possible that could happen with football. The thing about football is it is so wildly entertaining. It is so strategically dense. It is so graceful and beautiful to watch a great football player and the miracle of their bodies. It's the kind of heroism and poise and physical agility that we all wish to possess, and Americans love more than anything to see greatness. We love to see a Barry Sanders who, in the ruin of massive bodies that could, you know, paralyze him in the next second, he spots the one aperture where he can actually break through the line, and his body is capable of turning at an angle more quickly and with more explosive power than any of us can even dream about. And suddenly he's through the hole, and there's just 50 yards between him and glory, and it's all green and beautiful. That is amazing. So smoking's not, I mean, they tried to make it very glamorous in the movies, but football, the central thing is that fans incur none of the risk. We enjoy all of the benefits, but we incur none of the risk. You as a father made a decision, and a lot of other fathers make that decision, and increasingly as the medical science catches up, in communities where there's a communal sense that education is important and kids' academic and neurological health is super important, that will continue to happen, and Pop Warner numbers will decrease. And what will happen is what Malcolm Gladwell calls a further ghettoization of the game. And what we'll have is an exaggeration of what we already have. Correct.
Florida has more players than the NFL than anywhere else. It's the poorest town in the
Right.
poorest state.
Right. And that's essentially us consenting to that arrangement I talked about. Where and Obama, I think, by the way, is the wimp in chief on this. He actually said out loud into a microphone that he wouldn't let his own son play, but that he sure loves watching the game. I want you to think about what he just said. He said, let some other set of parents have their kids risk getting brain damage so that I can sit back in my fucking easy chair in the Oval Office and watch a ball game. That's beneath his dignity, especially as somebody, a person of color was raised in an economically vulnerable, you know, with a single mom. It's unbelievable to me that he, of all people, doesn't connect the dots. It's despicable in its own way. Yep.
Would you say, assuming that we have the American bird's eye view of what's going on culturally and in the entertainment world and in the sports world,
yeah,
assuming that we do, would you say that perhaps you're touching up on a very simple fact that may or may not even be in the national consciousness, that football and or any other sport is more like the dangling carrot while the donkey doesn't really realize what's going on from behind it, and the rest of the politics are pushing this entire donkey through while people are dying, while people are ending up screwed.
Right.
I mean, are you touching up on that we can actually see this now, finally, thanks to technology and et cetera?
Yeah. Well, I think, I think that's probably overstating the case or oversimplifying it, but one of the arguments that I make in the book is that I believe that part of what's happened in American culture is that we increasingly see it in the way that we view sports. I mean, look at your TV. There are people competing cooking. There are people competing, pawning their items or buying shit. Everything And the way that politics is treated is not what are the moral consequences of the policies. It's what's the score? Who's up? Who's down? That's the only thing you read anymore about politics. It's not like what are people's. What's that? Right, but yeah.
And we're just watching sports going, yay. Meanwhile, we're getting without the grease.
Well, what I would say, just to particularize it a little bit, what you're saying is sports the opiate of the masses, right? Or the opiate of the masses, right? What I would say is it's certainly one of them. And I think it's no coincidence that the NFL has continued to ascend, especially sharply, because it presents a kind of simulated combat that's really morally very gratifying. Your team either wins or loses. Nobody seems to get hurt very much. It's very exciting. At the same time that somewhere far away, there are very abstract, morally incoherent wars being fought. I think I personally and a lot of other fans essentially turn to football as a kind of proxy form to get our yayas out and to see aggression and violence in a context where it's not only appropriate, but actually heroic. And rewarded, absolutely. I definitely think that's happening, but I think it's a little bit oversimplifying to say it's the only thing. I think that's actually, I think Americans use a lot of stuff to look away from. We don't like to morally interrogate our pleasures. We love bacon. We definitely don't want to see the slaughterhouse. And that's bigger than football, but it's certainly represented in our capacity to wildly consume the sport and never think of ourselves as the sponsors of the game. We just say, well, whatever, I'm just watching. It was just on. Don't blame me. I didn't go to the game. I don't own a jersey, right? Okay, maybe one or two more questions.
What do you think about the future of the name of the Washington football team?
Yeah. So, it's one of those stories, a little bit like Ray Rice or Adrian Peterson, where I feel like, the big moral issues with football are, I'm not saying that's unimportant. I think it's more symbolic of the fact that we have a different moral code when we look at athletics and specifically when we look at football. I think in almost any other setting, like a corporate setting, we would not be like, sure, go ahead and use a slur for Native Americans. That sounds like a great new product. Wow, the Cincinnati Apache scalpers, great, I love it. That's a why don't we call it you would not try to market like a new blade by saying, it'll scalp your carrots like those Navajo used to scalp that's not the way you would advertise. Everybody would think, they would be like, that's actually not okay anymore, right? Just like it's not okay to be a bigot in other ways. But when we look at football, we go to a different place morally. We just have a different set of standards. Because after all, take Ray Rice, for example. Think about a brain. A brain does not know what's happening outside of it. It's just a brain. It's just either it's traumatized or it's just, synapses are firing. What happened to Janae Palmer in that elevator was that her brain got concussed. And because it was within a certain context off the field and she was knocked unconscious by her big, strong boyfriend, we were like, holy shit, that's completely unacceptable and it's a moral crisis. And especially if there's video, we better just be in a tizzy about it for a month and pretend like that's a big deal. But there were half a dozen brains that suffered the exact same trauma on playing fields in the NFL, and probably, I'm going to say 30 or 40 on college fields, maybe more than that on a particular weekend, and maybe 1,000 on high school fields that suffered the exact same trauma as Janae Palmer. The brain was concussed and was temporarily unconscious. And we didn't bat an eyelash. We just apply a different set of morals when we look at football. All this book is trying to do essentially is say, let's actually apply the same set of morals that we do as parents and as citizens in our normal lives to this hugely influential, beautiful, savage game. I almost don't care. I'm saying that because it's like it's such a specific problem. It's like what I care about is, are Americans going to start to be in a state of moral struggle about their devotion to the game? You know what I mean? Like, I'm much more concerned about the fact that nearly a third of NFL players are going to get long-term brain damage by the NFL's own admission than the fact that there was this off-the-field violence. The off-the-field violence, it seems to me, is completely predictable when you select for players who are rewarded for their aggression and under a lot of pressure and 23 years old and have to make sudden decisions that usually require, when they're under a lot of pressure, like asserting their violence or their dominance in the world. It's like, well, of course they don't suddenly become gentleman role models the moment they step over a chalk line. That's not how people's psyches work, right? So I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but it feels like a smaller question within the larger question of whether we're ever going to reckon with the sport's larger corruptions. Okay, maybe one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Seems like you're starting at the wrong end because you're focusing on the NFL where it's lots of money. Why not start by abolishing all the Pop Warner, then do it at the high school level, physicians, educators, and then they'll have to create their own field. They'll have to create their own field system.
So let me say a couple of things. One is that at the end of this book, full of complaints, I actually do have a bunch of suggestions, and one of them is that football shouldn't be played in public high schools. It should be played like the Europeans do in private leagues. But you can't stop people from doing something that they want to do. This is America. People get to make their own decisions. And parents, and in consultation with their kids, obviously, can allow their kids to play football. Like, this is America. Yeah, absolutely, but it's still America. Like, the contract we've made is that people have the right to make bad decisions, whether it's smoking or playing football or drinking alcohol or whatever it is. I'm not trying to push back. Yes, we can all agree in our reasonable NPR way that it would be better if there wasn't a game that was corrosive to people's brains and so forth in high school. But people have the right to behave as they want. The question is, will the culture as a whole become cognizant of the risks of the game, and will individual moral actors, parents or kids who play, make that decision on their own? Okay? That's the larger question. All right, I'm going to read just one more thing. It's short. Okay? And then and then if people have questions or they want me to spray some fuck it on them, I will happily do that. You can also buy a book, which you should definitely do, from Books and Books, which is awesome. And I want to thank you guys for being here, and Chuck, and certainly Mitchell for all the great work he does, and his staff. Okay, this is just the end of the book, and I want to try to wind up with this because I've been very didactic this evening, and this is really more the spirit that the book is written in. Maybe the way to think of football is as a kind of refuge. Maybe it's so popular because it's the one huge cultural space where we can safely indulge all the stuff we haven't worked out yet as a people. Our lust for violence, our racial neuroses, our yearning for patriarchal dominion, our sexual hang-ups. It's the place where men get to be boys before the age of reason, before the age of guilt. But I keep thinking also about this young woman I met the other night who found out I was writing a book about football and got very excited and told me she was a huge fan of the Philadelphia Eagles, that she had an Eagles hat in her bag. Did I want to see it? She told me football was what kept her connected to her hometown and to her dad especially. Quote, every weekend he'd go hunting for deer and he'd kill one and make venison burgers and we'd watch the Eagles game. That was our thing. Her face was shining with love. What's your book about anyway? She said. So I did that thing where I marched out all my arguments, which were supposed to make me feel righteous, but I looked at this young woman, at her sad eyes, and all I felt was petty and cruel. The Philadelphia Eagles had given her something precious to share with her father. What right did I have to shit on that? So I want to say to her and to you, I'm sorry. The point of this book isn't to shit on your happiness. It isn't to win some cultural argument. Let's make it larger than that. Let's make it an honest conversation between ourselves and within ourselves about why we come to football, about why we need a beautiful, savage game to feel fully alive, to feel united, and to love the people we love. Thanks.
All right, folks, then if there are no more questions, we have Against Football as well as some of Mr. Almond's previous titles for sale at the counter over there. He's going to be signing here at the table. I want to thank our guest, Mr. Chuck Strauss, and this has just been a terrific presentation. Let's please give Steve another hand. Thanks very much.